Hello there, and welcome back to Real Conflict Zone. I'm your host, and before we dive into today's intense story, I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us. Whether you're watching during your lunch break, winding down after a long day, or perhaps it's late at night where you are, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend your time here with us. If you're new to the channel, welcome to the community. We explore real conflict scenarios, stories of survival, and the human capacity for both vengeance and justice. If you enjoy what you're about to hear, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell so you never miss a story. And for those of you who've been with us from the beginning, thank you for your continued support. Now let's get into today's story, and I promise you this one is going to stay with you long after it's over. They took his brother. He took their empire. This is the story of one man against the most dangerous cartel in Mexico, a tale of grief transformed into fury, of engineering genius turned into instruments of war, and of a mechanic who became the cartel's worst nightmare. This is the story of Miguel Santos, a man who had everything taken from him and decided that if he was going to die, he would die taking down everyone responsible. But to understand how Miguel became what the cartel would eventually call El Fantasma, the ghost, we need to go back to the beginning, to a time when he was just a simple mechanic with calloused hands and oil under his fingernails, living a quiet life in a town that had learned long ago to keep its head down and its mouth shut. Ciudad Frontera sits like a wounded animal on the border between two worlds, a town that belongs fully to neither Mexico nor the United States, but exists in the shadowy space between them, governed not by law but by fear, not by police but by the serpient cartel, the snake that had wrapped itself around the town's throat and squeezed until there was barely any life left in it. The cartel had been there for as long as anyone could remember, their presence as constant as the sun that baked the streets and the dust that covered everything. They controlled the drugs that flowed north across the border, the weapons that flowed south, the money that moved in both directions, and most importantly, they controlled the people. Everyone in Ciudad Frontera knew someone who had disappeared, someone who had asked the wrong question or refused to pay the right bribe or simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The cartel's message was clear, and it was written in blood on the streets, in the bodies that turned up in ditches, in the severed heads left on doorsteps as warnings. The message was simple. We own you. We own this town. We own your life. And if you forget that even for a moment, we will remind you in ways you will never forget. Miguel Santos had grown up in this world, had learned its rules the way other children learn to read and write. His father had been a mechanic before him, had taught him everything about engines and transmissions and the thousand small mysteries of making broken things work again. His father had also taught him the most important lesson of all, which was to keep your head down, do your work, take care of your family, and never, ever cross the cartel. For 32 years, Miguel had followed that advice. He had opened his own garage, Garcia Auto Repair, in a converted warehouse on the edge of town. He specialized in the kind of work that required real skill, the difficult jobs that other mechanics turned away. He could rebuild an engine from scratch, could diagnose problems that left other mechanics baffled, could take a vehicle that seemed beyond repair and make it run like new. His reputation had spread, and people came from all over the region to have Miguel work on their vehicles. He charged fair prices, did honest work, and minded his own business. He had a small house, a loyal dog named Lobo, and his younger brother Carlos. Carlos was everything Miguel was not. Where Miguel was quiet and careful, Carlos was loud and reckless. Where Miguel had learned to navigate the dangerous waters of life in Ciudad Frontera by making himself invisible, Carlos seemed determined to make waves. He was 26 years old, handsome and charming, with their mother's bright smile and their father's stubborn pride. He worked at the garage with Miguel, but his heart was never really in it. Carlos dreamed of bigger things, of leaving Ciudad Frontera and making something of himself in the capital, or maybe even crossing the border to the United States. He talked about these dreams constantly, and Miguel would listen with a mixture of affection and fear, because he knew that dreams were dangerous things in a place like this. Dreams made you dissatisfied with your lot in life, made you forget the rules, made you think you could be something other than what the cartel allowed you to be? The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in late September. Miguel arrived at the garage just after dawn, the way he always did, unlocking the heavy metal doors and breathing in the familiar smell of motor oil and metal and the faint scent of coffee from the pot he would put on as soon as he got inside. He was surprised to find Carlos already there, sitting on an overturned crate in the dim light that filtered through the high windows. Carlos looked terrible, his face pale and drawn, his hands shaking as he tried to light a cigarette. Miguel felt his stomach drop, that sinking feeling you get when you know something is very wrong, but you don't yet know how wrong it is. He walked over to his brother slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last, and he asked the question even though part of him didn't want to know the answer. "What happened, Carlos? What did you do?" Carlos looked up at him with eyes that were equal parts fear and defiance, and he told Miguel the story. It had happened 3 nights ago at a bar on the south side of town, one of those places where the cartel's enforcers like to drink and where smart people knew to stay away from. But Carlos had never been particularly smart about these things, had never learned to see danger until it was right in front of him. He had gone there with some friends, had drunk too much, had gotten into a game of poker in the back room. The game had been run by a man everyone called Flaco, a mid-level enforcer for the Serpiente cartel, a man with dead eyes and a reputation for violence that was impressive even by the cartel standards. Carlos had won big, had taken something like $5,000 from the pot, and then, because the tequila had made him stupid, and because he was young enough to still believe he was invincible, Carlos had made a joke about how Flaco played poker about as well as he did his job for the cartel, which was to say, not very well at all. The room had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that comes right before violence, the kind of quiet where everyone is holding their breath waiting to see if blood is about to be spilled. Flaco had stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor, and he had looked at Carlos with those dead eyes. And for a moment, Carlos had finally understood what kind of mistake he had made. But then one of Flaco's friends had laughed, had slapped Flaco on the back, and said something about how the kid had balls even if he didn't have brains. And somehow the moment had passed. Flaco had smiled, had told Carlos to take his winnings and get out, had said they'd settle up another time. Carlos had taken the money and run, had thought he'd gotten away with it, had actually thought he was going to be okay. Miguel listened to all of this with a growing sense of horror because he knew what Carlos apparently still didn't understand. There was no such thing as getting away with it, not with the cartel. They didn't forget insults. They didn't let disrespect go unanswered. And they certainly didn't let some nobody mechanic's kid make a fool out of one of their enforcers in front of witnesses. The fact that Flaco had let Carlos walk out of that bar alive didn't mean Carlos was safe. It meant Flaco was planning something, was deciding how to make an example out of Carlos in a way that would send the right message to anyone else who might be thinking about showing disrespect. Miguel grabbed Carlos by the shoulders, shook him, told him they had to leave town right now tonight, had to get across the border or down to the capital or anywhere that wasn't here. But Carlos shook his head, said he couldn't run, said he had the money from the poker game, and he'd been planning to use it to pay off some debts, to help Miguel expand the garage, to finally start building the life he'd always talked about. Miguel wanted to scream at him, wanted to shake him until he understood that none of that mattered anymore, that the only thing that mattered was getting away before the cartel came for him. But it was already too late. Miguel heard the sound of vehicles pulling up outside the garage, heard car doors slamming and the sound of boots on concrete. He looked at Carlos and saw his brother's face go white as he finally understood. Miguel moved fast, pushed Carlos toward the back of the garage where there was a small office and a rear exit that led to an alley. He told Carlos to run, to get out through the back and keep running and not stop for anything. But when they reached the office, they found that the back door was already blocked. 3 men stood there, cartel soldiers with automatic weapons and cold smiles. They had been expecting Carlos to run. They had planned for it. One of them, a young guy with a scorpion tattooed on his neck, told Carlos that Flaco wanted to talk to him, wanted to settle their business like men. Carlos looked at Miguel, and Miguel saw in his brother's eyes that he knew this was the end, that there was no talking with Flaco, no settling anything, that this was just the beginning of whatever terrible thing the cartel had planned for him. Miguel stepped forward, put himself between his brother and the cartel soldiers, and he did something he had never done in his entire life. He challenged them. He told them that Carlos was sorry for what he'd said, that he'd been drunk and stupid, but he meant no real disrespect, that he'd return the money and they could all forget this ever happened. The soldier with the scorpion tattoo laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and he told Miguel that it was cute that he thought he had any say in what happened next. He told Miguel that Flaco had sent them to collect Carlos, and that's what they were going to do. And if Miguel tried to stop them, then they'd take him too, and Flaco could decide what to do with both brothers. Miguel looked at the guns, looked at the men holding them, looked at his brother standing behind him shaking like a leaf in a storm, and he made a calculation. He couldn't stop them. He couldn't save Carlos. Not here, not now. But maybe if he cooperated, if he didn't make trouble, they'd go easy on Carlos. Maybe they'd just rough him up a bit, take the money, teach him a lesson, and let him go. It was a thin hope, the kind of hope that people cling to when they have nothing else. But it was all Miguel had, so he stepped aside. He let them take Carlos. He watched as they grabbed his brother and dragged him toward their vehicles, watched as Carlos looked back at him with eyes full of terror and betrayal, as if asking how Miguel could let this happen, how he could just stand there and watch. Miguel wanted to tell him that there was no other choice, that fighting would only get them both killed, that this was the only way. But the words stuck in his throat, and before he could say anything at all, Carlos was gone, thrown into the back of a black SUV that roared off down the street, leaving Miguel standing alone in his garage with the taste of ash in his mouth and the knowledge that he had just made the worst mistake of his life. For the rest of that day and all through the night, Miguel tried to find out what had happened to Carlos. He called everyone he knew, asked questions as carefully as he could, tried to find someone who knew where the cartel had taken his brother. But no one would talk to him. People who had been friends for years suddenly didn't recognize his number when he called. People who owed him favors suddenly had pressing business elsewhere. The message was clear. Carlos had crossed the cartel, and anyone who tried to help him would be crossing the cartel too. Miguel drove through the city, checked all the places he could think of, even drove past Flaco's house, a gaudy mansion on the edge of town surrounded by high walls and security cameras. But there was no sign of Carlos, no sign of anything except the night and the darkness, and the awful certainty growing in Miguel's chest that he was never going to see his brother alive again. The call came 3 days later. Not a phone call, but a summons delivered by a boy who couldn't have been more than 12 years old. One of the countless children the cartel used to run messages and drugs and do all the small jobs that didn't require someone to be old enough or stupid enough to ask questions. The boy handed Miguel a piece of paper with an address written on it and a time, midnight. Then the boy left before Miguel could ask any questions, disappearing into the crowded market like he'd never been there at all. Miguel knew it was a trap. He knew the cartel didn't send invitations to midnight meetings because they wanted to have a conversation. But he also knew he had no choice. This was about Carlos. This was his last chance to save his brother, or at least to find out what had happened to him. So when midnight came, Miguel climbed into his truck and drove to the address on the paper. It was a warehouse district on the outskirts of town, a place where legitimate businesses ended and cartel operations began, where the streetlights had been shot out long ago, and where the only sounds were the distant barking of dogs and the occasional gunshot echoing across the empty lots. Miguel found the right building, a squat concrete structure with no windows and a single metal door. He parked his truck and walked to the door, his heart hammering in his chest, his mouth dry, every instinct screaming at him to run, to get back in his truck and drive as far and as fast as he could. But he didn't run. He knocked on the door. It opened immediately as if they'd been waiting for him. A man he didn't recognize, another cartel soldier, gestured for him to come inside. Miguel stepped through the door into darkness that smelled of rust and fear. His eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light provided by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The warehouse was mostly empty, just bare concrete floors and walls covered in graffiti and water stains. In the center of the space, there was a chair. Someone was sitting in the chair. Even from across the room, even in the bad light, Miguel recognized his brother. He started to run toward Carlos, but hands grabbed him from behind, strong hands that held him in place while his eyes took in details he would never be able to forget. Carlos was tied to the chair with wire that had cut into his wrists and ankles, leaving dark stains on his clothes. His face was swollen almost beyond recognition, a mass of bruises and cuts. One eye was swollen completely shut. His nose was clearly broken, bent at an angle that made Miguel's stomach turn. There was blood, so much blood, dried and crusted on Carlos's face and chest and puddled on the floor beneath the chair. Miguel screamed his brother's name, fought against the hands holding him, but it was useless. He was dragged forward, forced to his knees about 10 feet from where Carlos sat. That's when he saw that Carlos was trying to say something, his lips moving, sounds coming out that might have been words if his mouth wasn't so destroyed. Miguel strained to hear, leaned forward as far as the men holding him would allow, and he finally made out what Carlos was saying. Sorry, over and over again. Sorry, Miguel. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Miguel tried to tell him it was okay, that he was going to get him out of there, that everything was going to be fine. But the lies died in his throat because both of them knew that nothing was ever going to be fine again. Footsteps echoed in the warehouse, and a man walked out of the shadows. Flaco. He was smaller than Miguel had imagined, a thin man with a narrow face and eyes that reminded Miguel of a snake's eyes, cold and empty and utterly without mercy. Flaco walked over to Carlos, circled the chair slowly, studying his work the way an artist might study a painting. Then he turned to Miguel and smiled, and that smile was somehow worse than anything else Miguel had seen that night. Flaco told Miguel that this was what happened to people who disrespected the cartel. This was what happened to people who thought they could take what wasn't theirs and make jokes at the expense of their betters. He said that Carlos had learned his lesson, learned it very thoroughly over the past 3 days, and now it was time for Miguel to learn a lesson too. The lesson, Flaco explained, was about consequences. The lesson was that actions had prices, and those prices had to be paid. Carlos had insulted Flaco, had taken his money, had made him look weak in front of his men. For that, Carlos had to die. But killing him quickly, with a bullet to the head, that would be too easy, too clean. People wouldn't remember it. It wouldn't serve as a proper warning. So Flaco had taken his time with Carlos, had made sure that everyone in Ciudad Frontera would hear about what happened to the mechanic's kid who thought he could disrespect the Serpiente cartel. And now, Flaco said, now Miguel got to watch the end. Miguel got to see what happened to his brother because of his own failure to teach the boy respect. Miguel got to carry this moment with him for the rest of his life, however long or short that life might be. Flaco pulled out a gun, a silver-plated pistol that gleamed in the dim light. The kind of weapon that was more about status than practicality. He walked behind Carlos, put the gun against the back of his brother's head. Carlos stopped trying to speak. His body went rigid. For just a second, Miguel saw his brother's one good eye fix on him, saw something in that eye that might have been forgiveness or might have been accusation or might have been just the simple desire not to die alone in this terrible place. Then Flaco pulled the trigger. The sound was impossibly loud in the enclosed space, a crack that seemed to split the world in two. Carlos's body jerked forward against the restraints, then went slack. Blood and worse things sprayed across the concrete floor. Miguel heard a sound like an animal screaming, a sound of pure anguish and rage, and it took him a moment to realize the sound was coming from him. Flaco holstered his gun, wiped a speck of blood from his cheek, and turned to Miguel. He told him that he could leave now, could go back to his garage and his quiet little life. He said that the cartel had no quarrel with Miguel as long as Miguel remembered his place, remembered what happened to people who forgot the rules. He said that Carlos's body would be left in the street somewhere where people would find it, where it would serve as a reminder to everyone in Ciudad Frontera about the price of disrespect. Then Flaco and his men left, walking out of the warehouse and leaving Miguel alone with his brother's corpse and the smell of gunpowder and blood and the end of everything he had ever cared about. They found Carlos's body 2 days later, dumped in a ditch on the edge of town like he was trash, like his life had meant nothing at all. The police came, asked their perfunctory questions, filed their reports that everyone knew would go nowhere. The local priest performed a rushed funeral service attended by a handful of people, brave enough or foolish enough to be publicly associated with someone the cartel had killed. They buried Carlos in the town cemetery under a simple wooden cross because Miguel couldn't afford anything better after paying for the funeral. And then, as far as the rest of Ciudad Frontera was concerned, it was over. Carlos Santos was dead. Another statistic, another young man ground up and spit out by the cartel's machinery of violence. People who had known him stopped mentioning his name. The story of what happened to him became a cautionary tale parents told their children. This is what happens when you don't show respect, when you think you're smarter than you are, when you forget your place. But for Miguel, it wasn't over. It would never be over. He had gone back to his garage, had tried to lose himself in work the way he always had, but everything reminded him of Carlos, the tools his brother had used, the radio Carlos had liked to play too loud, the coffee mug with a stupid joke written on it that Carlos had thought was hilarious. Miguel would find himself standing in the middle of the garage, a wrench in his hand, with no memory of how he'd gotten there or what he'd been planning to do. He stopped eating. He barely slept, and when he did sleep, he dreamed of the warehouse, of Flaco's smile, of the sound the gun had made, of Carlos's one good eye looking at him in that last moment. People in town started to worry about him. His few remaining friends tried to talk to him, tried to tell him that he needed to move on, that there was nothing he could have done, that this was just the way things were in a place like Ciudad Frontera. But Miguel didn't want to move on. Moving on meant accepting what had happened, meant accepting that his brother was dead, and the men who killed him were still walking around free, still drinking in bars and laughing and living their lives while Carlos rotted in the ground. Miguel found he couldn't accept that. He didn't want to accept it. And somewhere in the depths of his grief and rage, an idea began to form. It started small, just a thought that he pushed away at first because it was crazy, because it was suicidal, because it violated everything his father had taught him about survival. The thought was simple. What if he didn't just accept it? What if he did something about it? The old Miguel, the careful, quiet Miguel who had spent his whole life keeping his head down, would never have entertained such a thought for more than a moment. But that Miguel had died in the warehouse with his brother. The man who remained was someone new, someone forged in grief and rage, someone who had already lost everything that mattered and therefore had nothing left to lose. He started to plan. Not some wild, half-baked scheme driven by emotion, but a real plan, methodical and careful, using the skills and knowledge he had developed over a lifetime of working with machines. Miguel had always been good with his hands, good at understanding how things worked, how they fit together, how to take them apart and put them back together better than before. He had spent 3 decades learning the mysteries of engines and transmissions and electrical systems. Now he began to apply that knowledge to a different kind of problem. How do you fight an organization that has money, guns, men, and no rules? How does one man take on a cartel? The answer, Miguel realized, was that you couldn't fight them the way they expected to be fought. You couldn't shoot it out with them, couldn't challenge them directly, because they had more guns and more men and more experience with violence than you could ever hope to match. But what if you didn't fight fair? What if you used their own tactics against them? Hit and run, strike from the shadows, make them afraid the way they made everyone else afraid. Miguel began to gather information. He listened to gossip in the market, paid attention to conversations in bars, pieced together the structure of the cartel's local operation. He learned who reported to whom, who was in charge of what, where they lived, where they conducted business, what their routines were. He learned that Flaco ran 3 drug distribution points in different parts of the city, that he collected protection money from businesses every day Friday, that he had a girlfriend who lived in an apartment near the market, and a wife who lived in the mansion on the edge of town. He learned the names of Flaco's lieutenants, the men who carried out his orders, the enforcers who did the actual dirty work, and he began to understand that the cartel, for all its power and ruthlessness, had vulnerabilities. They were arrogant. They believed they were untouchable. They had grown lazy and predictable because no one had ever really challenged them before. In his garage, late at night when no one was around to see, Miguel began to build. He started with simple things, tools that could serve double purposes. a cutting torch that could cut through locks and chains, a welding rig that could be used to reinforce a vehicle or create barriers. But then he moved on to more sophisticated projects, using his knowledge of mechanics and electronics and chemistry, skills he had picked up over the years from books and experimentation, and the kind of curiosity that had always driven him to understand how things worked. He built remote detonators using cell phones and car alarms. He created improvised explosive devices from fertilizer and fuel oil, carefully researching the ratios and detonation methods online, using the anonymous connection at the town library because he knew the cartel monitored internet usage. He converted propane tanks into bombs, engineered timing devices, created pressure switches and motion sensors. He modified his truck, reinforcing the frame, installing hidden compartments, upgrading the engine for speed and power. He built a ghillie suit from burlap and local vegetation, designed to let him blend into the scrubland that surrounded the city. He acquired weapons, not by buying them, which would have left a trail, but by stealing them from the cartel itself. He started small, breaking into the cars of low-level dealers, taking their guns while they were inside conducting business. He hit a drug stash house one night, waiting until the guards were drunk and careless, slipping in through a back window and taking 2 AK-47s and 3 pistols, along with several kilos of cocaine that he later burned just for the satisfaction of destroying something the cartel valued. Each successful theft made him bolder, taught him more about how the cartel operated, where they were vulnerable, how they responded to threats. For 3 months, Miguel prepared. He trained himself, spending hours in the desert practicing shooting, learning to move quietly, building up his endurance and his tolerance for discomfort. He had been strong from years of physical labor, but now he pushed himself further, running miles in the heat of the day, doing push-ups and pull-ups until his muscles screamed, teaching his body to endure pain because he knew there would be plenty of pain coming. He studied everything he could find about guerrilla warfare, urban combat, improvised weapons and tactics. He read about the IRA in Ireland, the Viet Cong in Vietnam, the resistance fighters in World War II, anyone who had ever successfully fought a larger, better-equipped force. He absorbed their lessons, adapted their tactics to his own situation, began to think of himself not as a mechanic, but as a soldier fighting a war. And then, when he was ready, when he had prepared as thoroughly as he knew how, Miguel Santos began his campaign of vengeance. He decided to start with the lowest level of the organization, the street dealers and collectors who were the foundation of the cartel's power. These were the men who actually interacted with the public, who collected the protection money, who sold the drugs, who enforced the cartel's will at the most basic level. They were numerous, poorly trained, and complacent, used to people being afraid of them, used to no one ever fighting back. The first one was a dealer named Ricky who worked a corner in the warehouse district, selling heroin and methamphetamine to the addicts who lived in the abandoned buildings nearby. Miguel watched him for 3 days, learning his routine. Ricky showed up every night around 9, stayed until 3 or 4 in the morning, then drove home to a small house on the south side of town. He was usually alone, though occasionally another dealer would stop by to resupply him or collect money. He kept his drugs in a backpack and his money in a fanny pack around his waist. He carried a pistol tucked into his waistband, but seemed to feel safe enough that he rarely paid attention to his surroundings. On the 4th night, Miguel struck. He waited until Ricky was alone, until the corner was empty of customers, until the moment was right. Then he walked up behind Ricky, moving silently in the darkness. And before the dealer could react, Miguel hit him in the back of the head with a heavy wrench. Ricky went down hard, unconscious before he hit the pavement. Miguel dragged him into an alley, zip-tied his hands and feet, took his gun and his drugs and his money. Then he pulled out a knife, the same knife he used for cutting gaskets and trimming rubber hoses, and he held it in front of Ricky's face until the dealer's eyes fluttered open and he understood what was happening. Miguel told him to deliver a message. He said that Carlos Santos had a brother, and that brother was coming for everyone involved in Carlos's death. He said that the Serpiente cartel thought they owned Ciudad Frontera, thought they could kill whoever they wanted without consequences. But they were wrong. The consequences were here. The consequences had a name, El Fantasma, the ghost, because ghosts couldn't be killed, couldn't be stopped, couldn't be bargained with. El Fantasma was coming for all of them, one by one, and nothing would save them. Then Miguel cut off the little finger on Ricky's left hand, ignoring the dealer's screams, and he told him that was so he'd remember the message, so he wouldn't forget to deliver it. Miguel left Ricky in the alley, bleeding and terrified but alive, because he needed someone to spread the word, needed the cartel to know they were being hunted. Then he went home, burned his clothes, cleaned the blood off his tools, and tried not to think about the fact that he had just crossed a line he could never uncross. He had become something different, something his father would have been ashamed of, something his brother might have been frightened of. But Carlos was dead, and shame and fear were luxuries Miguel could no longer afford. The message spread quickly. By the next day, everyone in the criminal underworld of Ciudad Frontera knew that someone was targeting cartel members, that a street dealer had been attacked and mutilated and left with threats about a ghost seeking revenge. Most people thought Ricky had made it up, had invented the story to cover for the fact that he'd lost his drugs and money. But 2 nights later, Miguel struck again. Another dealer, this one named Chivo, was found unconscious in his car with a bomb strapped to his chest. The bomb was a dummy, just a bundle of road flares wrapped with duct tape and wired to look real. But Chivo didn't know that. He'd woken up, seen the bomb, and panicked, screaming for help until someone called the police. When they cut the fake bomb off him, they found another message, this one carved into his chest with a knife. El Fantasma sees you. Now people started to pay attention. 2 attacks in 3 days, both targeting low-level cartel members, both accompanied by messages about a ghost seeking vengeance. The cartel leadership met to discuss what to do about this. Flaco, who should have been concerned since the attack seemed to be revenge for Carlos Santos's death, instead dismissed the whole thing as probably just some rival organization trying to muscle in on their territory. He ordered his men to increase security, to travel in pairs, to be on the lookout for anything suspicious. But he didn't seem to take the threat seriously. After all, what could one man do against the might of the Serpiente cartel? Miguel showed him. Over the next 2 weeks, he hit 6 more cartel members. He burned down a stash house, timing the attack for when the guards were outside and the building was empty. So the only casualties were the drugs going up in flames. He ambushed a money collector, knocking him out and taking nearly $50,000 in protection payments, money he later distributed anonymously to families in the poor neighborhoods, leaving it in envelopes on doorsteps like some kind of twisted Robin Hood. He sabotaged vehicles, cutting brake lines and loosening lug nuts, causing 2 separate accidents that left cartel enforcers hospitalized, but not dead, because Miguel wasn't trying to kill at random. He was sending a message. He was creating fear and chaos. He was making them understand that nowhere was safe, that anyone could be next. The cartel responded predictably with violence. They started shooting up places they thought might be connected to the attacks. They tortured suspected informants. They put out the word that there was a substantial reward for information leading to El Fantasma. But it did them no good, because no one knew who El Fantasma was. Miguel had been so careful, had left no evidence, no witnesses who saw his face, nothing to connect the attacks to a dead boy's grieving brother. During the day, he was still just Miguel the mechanic, quiet and sad, working in his garage, keeping to himself. At night, he became someone else, someone who moved through the darkness like smoke, striking without warning and disappearing without a trace. But Miguel knew he couldn't just keep hitting random targets. To truly hurt the cartel, to make them feel the kind of pain he felt, he needed to go higher up the chain. He needed to start targeting the people who mattered, the lieutenants and captains who actually ran operations. And at the top of that list was Flaco, the man who had pulled the trigger, the man who had smiled while doing it. But Flaco wasn't some street dealer who could be jumped in an alley. He was careful, was surrounded by bodyguards, moved in armored vehicles, rarely went anywhere without heavy security. Taking him down would require something more than just a surprise attack. It would require planning, patience, and a willingness to take enormous risks. Miguel started by targeting Flaco's lieutenants, the men who reported directly to him, the men who ran his various operations. The first was a man named Jorge, who oversaw the cartel's protection racket, collecting money from businesses throughout the city. Jorge lived in a nice house in a gated community, the kind of place where the walls were high and the security guards were paid to look the other way when cartel members came and went. He drove an expensive Mercedes, wore designer clothes, and had a reputation for being even more brutal than Flaco, if that was possible. Jorge had a particular fondness for using acid to punish people who didn't pay their protection money, had a standing order with a chemical supply company for industrial quantities of hydrochloric acid. The stories about what Jorge had done to people who crossed him were the stuff of nightmares. Miguel spent 2 weeks studying Jorge's routine, learning his patterns. Jorge was careful, but also a creature of habit. Every Thursday night, he went to a strip club on the east side of town, a place the cartel owned, where he would drink and party until the early hours of the morning. He always took 2 bodyguards with him, always parked in the back lot where his car would be secure. This was Miguel's opportunity. He spent days preparing, building what he needed, testing and retesting to make sure everything would work exactly as planned. Then on a Thursday night, while Jorge was inside the club, Miguel slipped into the parking lot. He'd prepared for this moment, had created a device that was part art and part science, a testament to what someone with the right knowledge and no conscience could accomplish. He attached a small explosive charge to the underside of Jorge's Mercedes, using magnets to hold it in place right above the fuel tank. The charge was connected to the car's ignition system, so that when Jorge turned the key, the electrical pulse would trigger the detonator. But Miguel had added a refinement, a delay mechanism that would give Jorge time to start the car, to put it in gear, to drive out onto the street where everyone would see what happened next. Miguel wanted witnesses. He wanted the cartel to know that their leaders weren't safe anymore, that their expensive cars and gated communities and bodyguards couldn't protect them from El Fantasma. Miguel waited in the shadows across the street, watching through a pair of binoculars he'd taken from a hunting store. Just after 2 in the morning, Jorge emerged from the club, drunk and laughing, a woman on each arm, his bodyguards following close behind. They piled into the Mercedes, Jorge behind the wheel because he liked to drive when he was drunk, liked the feeling of power that came from controlling something fast and expensive. The engine roared to life, and Miguel counted in his head. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. The Mercedes pulled out of the parking lot and onto the street. 15 seconds. 20. And then the device activated. The explosion wasn't as large as Miguel had feared it might be, but it was large enough. The Mercedes became a fireball, a rolling inferno of twisted metal and burning gasoline. The car swerved, jumped the curb, and slammed into a storefront before finally coming to rest. Miguel could hear screaming, could see people running from the club to see what had happened. He stayed long enough to see that no one was getting out of that car, that Jorge and his bodyguards and the 2 women had all died instantly. Then he melted back into the darkness, moving quickly through alleys and back streets until he reached where he'd hidden his truck 3 blocks away. By the time the fire department arrived, Miguel was already halfway across town, driving carefully, obeying all traffic laws, just another vehicle on the road in the middle of the night. The cartel's response was swift and brutal. They locked down their operations, increased security across the board, and started a campaign of terror against anyone they suspected might be connected to the attacks. 3 people died in the first 24 hours, tortured to death in attempts to get them to reveal information about El Fantasma. But the torture produced nothing because there was nothing to reveal. No one knew who El Fantasma was. The ghost remained a ghost, invisible and untouchable. More importantly, Miguel's attack on Jorge had the desired effect. The cartel was afraid. For the first time in living memory, the Serpiente cartel was afraid. Their lower-level members started refusing assignments, started calling in sick, started finding excuses not to go out at night. Some simply disappeared, abandoning their positions and fleeing the city rather than wait around to be targeted. The cartel's operations began to suffer. Drug shipments were delayed. Protection money went uncollected. The smooth machinery of their criminal empire started to grind and stutter. Flaco called an emergency meeting of the cartel's leadership. Miguel knew about the meeting because he'd managed to plant a listening device in the office of one of Flaco's lieutenants, a man named Hector, who ran the cartel's weapons smuggling operation. The device was crude, just a modified cell phone taped under Hector's desk, but it worked well enough for Miguel to hear snippets of the conversation. What he heard told him that his campaign was working better than he'd dared hope. The cartel leadership was divided. Some wanted to pull back, to consolidate their operations, to hunker down until they could identify and eliminate the threat. Others wanted to escalate, to respond to El Fantasma's attacks with even greater violence, to make the entire city suffer until someone gave up the ghost. But Flaco, Miguel learned, had a different plan. Flaco believed that El Fantasma was a myth, a convenient fiction created to hide what was really happening, which was that a rival cartel was moving into their territory. He thought the attacks were too sophisticated, too well planned to be the work of one man. He was convinced that the Sinaloa cartel, or perhaps Los Zetas, was behind it, and he wanted to respond by going to war with them. This was both good news and bad news for Miguel. Good because it meant Flaco didn't suspect him specifically, didn't understand that this was personal, that this was about Carlos. Bad because if the Serpiente cartel went to war with another cartel, innocent people would die in the crossfire, and Miguel would be responsible for starting a conflict that would consume the entire region. He had to find a way to make it clear that this wasn't about territory or business, that this was about justice, about revenge, about making one man pay for his crimes. So Miguel decided to get personal. He started targeting not just cartel members, but their families, their possessions, the things they cared about. He burned down a lieutenant's house while the man was out, making sure the family escaped but destroying everything they owned. He vandalized the grave of a dead cartel boss, leaving a message spray-painted on the tombstone. Even the dead aren't safe from El Fantasma. He released the names and addresses of cartel members to a journalist in Mexico City, a man known for his anti-cartel reporting, ensuring that the information would be made public and that the cartel's members would have their anonymity stripped away. But his most audacious move came when he targeted Flaco's girlfriend, a young woman named Sofia who lived in an apartment near the market. Miguel had no intention of hurting her. Despite everything he'd become, he still drew a line at harming innocent people. But he wanted to send Flaco a message that no one close to him was safe. So late one night, Miguel broke into Sofia's apartment while she was sleeping. He didn't wake her, didn't touch her, didn't take anything. He simply left a message on her bathroom mirror, written in lipstick. Tell Flaco that El Fantasma is coming for him. Tell him that Carlos Santos is waiting. When Sofia woke up and found the message, she called Flaco immediately, hysterical with fear. And for the first time, Flaco began to understand that this wasn't about territory or business. This was about his decision to kill Carlos Santos. This was about revenge. And the man seeking that revenge was someone who had managed to penetrate every layer of the cartel's security, who could apparently go anywhere and do anything, who was willing to take any risk and make any sacrifice to destroy him. Flaco's response was to go underground. He moved out of his mansion and into a safe house, a fortified compound on the outskirts of the city that the cartel used for high-level meetings and hiding witnesses. He surrounded himself with his best men, 24-hour security, multiple layers of protection. He stopped going out, stopped conducting business in person, communicated only through encrypted phones and trusted intermediaries. He had become a prisoner of his own fear, trapped in a concrete box, afraid to show his face because somewhere out there, a ghost was hunting him. But Miguel was patient. He had learned over the months of his campaign that patience was his greatest weapon. The cartel expected dramatic gestures, expected violence and spectacle. They didn't expect someone who would wait weeks or months for the perfect opportunity, someone who would study and plan and prepare until success was all but guaranteed. So Miguel waited. He watched Flaco's safe house from a distance, mapped out the security, identified the guards in their rotations, looked for weaknesses in their defenses. And he found one. The safe house had its own generator because Flaco didn't trust the city's power grid, didn't want to be vulnerable to someone cutting the electricity. The generator was housed in a small shed about 50 yards from the main building, connected by an underground fuel line that fed from a large tank buried in the yard. Every 3 days, a truck would come to refill the fuel tank, and for about an hour during the refueling process, the generator would be shut down and the safe house would be running on backup batteries. It was a small window of vulnerability, but it was enough. Miguel spent 2 weeks preparing for what he knew would be his final operation. He built his largest bomb yet, a sophisticated device that combined his mechanical knowledge with everything he'd learned about explosives over the past months. The bomb was designed to be placed in the fuel tank, where it would sit undetected until Miguel triggered it remotely. The explosion would ignite the fuel, creating a massive fireball that would consume the generator shed and likely spread to the main building. Even if it didn't kill Flacco outright, it would create chaos, destroy the safe house's power supply, and force Flacco and his men out into the open, where they would be vulnerable. On a Tuesday afternoon, disguised as a worker from the fuel company, Miguel drove a stolen tanker truck up to the safe house. He had the right uniform, the right paperwork, forged but good enough to pass a casual inspection, and the right attitude of someone who'd done this job 1,000 times and found it boring. The guards at the gate checked his credentials, called the main house to confirm the delivery was expected, then waved him through. Miguel's heart was pounding so hard he thought they must be able to hear it, but his hands were steady as he maneuvered the truck into position next to the fuel tank. The refueling process took about 45 minutes. During that time, Miguel worked quickly, going through the motions of connecting hoses and pumping fuel while also accessing the underground tank. He'd brought the bomb in a compartment under the tanker truck, disguised as a toolbox. While the fuel flowed, Miguel opened the access port to the tank and lowered the bomb inside, securing it to the tank's interior wall with magnets. The bomb was waterproof, designed to function even when submerged in gasoline, and its detonator was connected to Miguel's phone through a cellular relay. When he was ready, he could trigger it with a simple text message. By the time Miguel finished the delivery and drove the tanker truck away from the safe house, he was soaked with sweat despite the cool afternoon air. His hands were shaking now that the danger had passed, adrenaline flooding his system. But he'd done it. He'd planted a bomb right under Flacco's nose, and no one had suspected a thing. Now came the hard part, waiting for the right moment. Miguel didn't want to trigger the bomb immediately. He wanted Flacco to feel safe first, wanted him to think that his fortress was impenetrable, that he could hide there indefinitely. So Miguel waited 3 days, then a week, then 2 weeks. During that time, he monitored the safe house, watching through binoculars from various vantage points, noting the patterns of the guards, the comings and goings of visitors. He listened to the radio chatter he'd intercepted using a scanner, piecing together information about what was happening inside. What he learned was that Flacco was losing control. The cartel's operations were falling apart without him there to manage them. His lieutenants were fighting among themselves, arguing about who should be in charge, making decisions that contradicted each other and led to confusion and lost revenue. Some of the younger members were talking about breaking away and starting their own organization. The Serpiente Cartel, which had seemed so powerful and untouchable just months ago, was tearing itself apart from the inside. And then, on a Thursday night 3 weeks after Miguel had planted the bomb, an opportunity presented itself. Miguel's scanner picked up chatter about a meeting at the safe house, a gathering of all the cartel's senior leadership to discuss what to do about the disintegration of their organization. Everyone would be there. Flacco, his remaining lieutenants, the captains who ran the various operations, even some representatives from the cartel's parent organization in Sinaloa who had come to see what was going wrong with their profitable franchise in Ciudad Frontera. It was the kind of target Miguel had dreamed of, a chance to take out not just Flacco, but the entire leadership structure in one blow. Miguel knew this was his moment. He also knew that this would likely be the last thing he ever did. Even if the bomb succeeded, even if he managed to kill everyone in that safe house, the cartel would hunt him down. They would torture everyone who'd ever known him, would burn down the city if that's what it took to find him. His life was effectively over the moment he pressed the button on his phone. But Carlos was dead, and Miguel had stopped caring about his own survival months ago. This wasn't about living. This was about making sure that the people who killed his brother paid the price. On the night of the meeting, Miguel positioned himself on a hill about half a mile from the safe house, far enough away to be safe from the explosion, but close enough to see the results. He had night vision binoculars, a radio scanner, and his phone. He watched as vehicles arrived at the compound, expensive SUVs and sedans. Watched as men in suits and carrying automatic weapons got out and were escorted inside. He counted them, 15, 20, 25 people. The entire leadership of the Serpiente Cartel all gathered in one place, all about to die. Miguel looked at his phone, at the message he'd already typed out, the simple code that would trigger the detonator. His finger hovered over the send button. He thought about Carlos, about his brother's last moments, about the fear in his eyes and the blood on the warehouse floor. He thought about all the other people the cartel had killed, all the families they'd destroyed, all the lives they'd ruined. He thought about his father's advice to keep his head down, to not make trouble, to just survive. And he thought about how survival didn't mean much if you couldn't live with yourself. Miguel pressed send. For a moment, nothing happened, and Miguel's heart sank. Had the bomb failed? Had it been discovered? But then the night lit up like a second sun. The explosion was massive, far larger than Miguel had anticipated. The fuel tank erupted with a force that shook the ground even from half a mile away, sending a column of fire hundreds of feet into the air. The generator shed simply ceased to exist, vaporized in the initial blast. The shock wave hit the main building, shattering every window, collapsing part of the roof. Secondary explosions followed as vehicles in the parking area caught fire, their gas tanks igniting, adding to the inferno. Miguel watched through his binoculars as the safe house became a vision of hell, flames consuming everything, thick black smoke rolling into the night sky. He could hear screams, could see people trying to escape the building, stumbling out into the yard where they were cut down by falling debris or engulfed by the spreading fire. The guards outside the compound abandoned their posts and ran, not toward the burning building to help, but away from it, fleeing into the darkness to save their own lives. It was over in less than 10 minutes. By the time the first fire trucks arrived, sirens wailing in the distance, the safe house was a gutted ruin, its walls cracked and blackened, its roof collapsed, flames still licking at what remained of the structure. Miguel knew that no one could have survived that blast. Flaco was dead. The cartel's leadership was dead. El Fantasma had won. But Miguel felt no satisfaction, no sense of triumph or justice served. He felt empty, hollowed out, as if the explosion had consumed something inside him, along with the men it had killed. He thought about his brother, wondered if Carlos would be proud of what he'd done or horrified by what he'd become. He thought about all the death he'd caused, all the destruction he'd wrought in the name of revenge. He thought about the fact that he was now a mass murderer, that he'd killed dozens of people over the past months, that there was blood on his hands that could never be washed away. Miguel climbed down from the hill and walked to where he'd hidden his truck. He drove slowly back towards Ciudad Frontera, listening to the radio reports that were already starting to come in about a massive explosion at a compound on the outskirts of the city. The reporters didn't know yet what had happened, who had died, but Miguel knew it wouldn't take long for them to figure it out. By morning, the entire country would know that the leadership of the Serpiente cartel had been wiped out in a single devastating attack. When Miguel reached his garage, he found it exactly as he'd left it, empty and quiet, smelling of motor oil and dust. He walked through the space where he'd spent so much of his life, where he'd worked alongside his brother, where Carlos had talked about his dreams of something better. Miguel realized that he'd destroyed those dreams as surely as the cartel had destroyed Carlos. He'd become the very thing he'd fought against, a dealer of death and violence, someone who solved problems with bombs and bullets. But it was too late now to go back, too late to undo what he'd done. Miguel gathered a few possessions, some clothes, his father's old watch, a photograph of Carlos, and put them in a backpack. He took one last look around the garage, then set it on fire. He stood outside and watched as the flames consumed the building, destroying the last physical evidence of his former life. The fire department would come eventually, but by then there would be nothing left to save. As the garage burned, Miguel walked to his truck and started the engine. He had no plan, no destination in mind. He only knew that he couldn't stay in Ciudad Frontera, that he had to disappear before the cartel's remaining. Members came looking for revenge. The organization might be decapitated, but there would still be soldiers, still be people loyal to the memory of what the Serpiente cartel had been, and they would want blood for what Miguel had done. He drove north toward the border, thinking that maybe he could cross into the United States, lose himself in some city where no one knew his name or his face. But as he drove through the dark streets of Ciudad Frontera for what he knew would be the last time, he passed through neighborhoods where people were already celebrating, Word had spread about the explosion, and people were dancing in the streets, setting off fireworks, embracing each other with tears of joy. For the first time in decades, Ciudad Frontera was free from the cartel's grip. The snake that had strangled the town for so long had finally been killed. Miguel realized that his campaign of revenge, his personal war against the people who'd killed his brother, had accomplished something he'd never intended. He'd liberated an entire town. He'd given these people their lives back, given them the freedom to live without fear. It didn't erase what he'd done, didn't make him less of a murderer, but it meant that his actions had consequences beyond just revenge. Carlos's death had led to the cartel's destruction, and in a strange way, that gave Carlos's life a meaning it wouldn't have had otherwise. As Miguel reached the outskirts of town, his phone rang. He almost didn't answer it, assuming it was someone who'd somehow tracked him down already. But then he saw the number was blocked, and curiosity got the better of him. He answered, expecting threats or demands, or maybe just silence. Instead, he heard a voice he didn't recognize. A man speaking calmly in Spanish. The man said that he knew who Miguel was, knew what he'd done, knew about El Fantasma in the campaign against the Serpiente cartel. Miguel's blood ran cold, his hand tightening on the steering wheel, ready to throw the phone out the window and drive faster. But then the man said something that made Miguel pause. The man said he represented certain interests, people who had been very impressed with Miguel's work over the past months, people who appreciated his skills, his dedication, his willingness to do what needed to be done, no matter the cost. These people, the man said, could offer Miguel an opportunity. They could make him disappear, give him a new identity, relocate him somewhere safe where the remnants of the Serpiente cartel would never find him. In exchange, Miguel would work for them, would use his unique talents to help them with certain problems that required a special kind of solution. Miguel asked who these people were, but the man wouldn't say directly. He only hinted that they were connected to the government, to agencies that operated in the shadows, doing things that couldn't be done officially or publicly. They needed people like Miguel, people who existed in the gray areas between law and chaos, people who could get things done without asking too many questions or worrying too much about collateral damage. The man gave Miguel 24 hours to decide. He said that if Miguel was interested, he should drive to a specific location near the border, a rest stop on the highway, and wait. Someone would meet him there and explain everything. If Miguel didn't show up, the man said, then they'd assume he wasn't interested, and Miguel would be on his own. The cartel would hunt him, and eventually they would find him, and when they did, his death would be slow and painful and serve as a warning to anyone else who thought about challenging them. The man hung up before Miguel could ask any more questions. Miguel sat in his truck on the side of the road, engine idling, staring at his phone. He thought about the offer, about what it would mean to accept it. He'd be trading one kind of prison for another, exchanging the cartel's noose for the government's leash. He'd be doing more killing, more violence, but this time for people who claimed to represent justice and order. Was that better? Was there really a difference? But the alternative was to run for the rest of his life, to live in fear, to wait for the day when someone recognized him or tracked him down and made him pay for what he'd done. And eventually that day would come. Miguel had killed too many people, made too many enemies. There was nowhere he could hide where they wouldn't eventually find him. So when the 24 hours had passed, Miguel drove to the rest stop the man had mentioned. It was a desolate place, just a parking lot and some bathrooms and vending machines, sitting beside the highway in the middle of nowhere. A few semi-trucks were parked there, drivers sleeping in their cabs, but otherwise the place was empty. Miguel pulled into a spot and waited, watching the road, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. A black SUV arrived an hour later, pulling up next to Miguel's truck. A man got out, the same age as Miguel, maybe a bit older, with the hard eyes of someone who'd seen too much violence. He gestured for Miguel to follow him, then walked to a picnic table near the bathrooms. Miguel followed, his hand resting on the pistol he had tucked in his waistband, not sure if this was a trap or if the offer had been genuine. The man introduced himself as Agent Ramirez, though Miguel doubted that was his real name. He worked for a special unit within Mexico's intelligence service, he explained. A unit that dealt with problems the government couldn't address through normal legal channels. Cartels, corrupt officials, foreign agents, anyone who threatened Mexico's stability or security. They operated without oversight, without rules, doing whatever was necessary to get results. Ramirez told Miguel that they'd been watching him for weeks, ever since El Fantasma had first appeared. They'd been impressed by his ingenuity, his ruthlessness, his ability to operate alone and accomplish what entire police units couldn't do. They saw potential in him, saw someone who could be an asset if properly directed. In exchange for his services, they would give him a new identity, a new life, and protection from anyone who might want revenge for what he'd done to the Serpiente cartel. Miguel asked what kind of work they'd want him to do. Ramirez was blunt. They'd want him to kill people, not random people, not innocent people, but specific targets that the government had identified as threats. Cartel leaders who couldn't be prosecuted because they'd bribed all the judges, politicians who were actively working against Mexico's interests, foreign agents who were operating illegally within the country. Miguel would be given targets, given resources, and expected to eliminate those targets using whatever methods he deemed appropriate. It was, Ramirez admitted, a morally complicated proposition. Miguel would essentially be a government-sanctioned assassin, doing the dirty work that no one else wanted to acknowledge existed. But Ramirez argued that it was necessary work, that Mexico was drowning in corruption and violence, and sometimes the only way to fight monsters was to become a monster yourself. He said that Miguel had already crossed that line, had already proven he was willing to do terrible things for what he believed was right. So why not do those terrible things for something larger than personal revenge? Why not use his skills to actually make Mexico safer, to protect people who couldn't protect themselves? Miguel sat at that picnic table for a long time, staring out at the desert, at the empty highway, at the harsh sunlight that made everything look bleached and lifeless. He thought about his brother, about his father, about the man he used to be before all of this started. He thought about the choice in front of him and realized it wasn't really a choice at all. He'd destroyed his old life when he'd started down this path. There was no going back to being Miguel the mechanic, the quiet man who fixed engines and minded his own business. That man was dead, killed in the same warehouse where Carlos had died. What remained was El Fantasma, the ghost, a weapon without a purpose now that his revenge was complete. Ramirez was offering him a new purpose, a way to give meaning to the skills he'd developed and the things he'd learned. Maybe it wasn't justice in the traditional sense, but then again, Miguel had learned that traditional justice didn't exist in places like Ciudad Frontera. Sometimes you had to create your own justice, had to be willing to get blood on your hands if you wanted to make any kind of difference. So Miguel accepted the offer. He shook Ramirez's hand, and in that moment, he stopped being Miguel Santos, the mechanic from Ciudad Frontera, and became something new. A shadow, a weapon, a ghost who would haunt Mexico's underworld for years to come, leaving a trail of dead cartel members and corrupt officials in his wake. He would never be free of the blood on his hands, would never stop seeing his brother's face in his dreams, would never fully reconcile what he'd become with what he'd once been. But he would have a purpose. And sometimes, when you've lost everything else, a purpose is all you have left. Epilogue: 5 years passed. In Ciudad Frontera, the town slowly rebuilt itself. New businesses opened. Children played in streets that had once been too dangerous to walk down. The police, no longer afraid of cartel reprisals, started actually doing their jobs. There were still problems, still poverty and struggles, but the stranglehold of fear had been broken. People talked about El Fantasma in whispers, debated whether he'd really existed or was just a myth, a story they'd told themselves to explain the sudden collapse of the Serpiente cartel. In a small house on the outskirts of Guadalajara, a man who called himself Antonio Diaz lived alone. He worked as a consultant for a security company, traveling frequently, keeping to himself. His neighbors thought he was quiet but polite, the kind of man who helped with heavy lifting when someone was moving furniture, but never accepted invitations to dinner parties or neighborhood gatherings. They didn't know that Antonio Diaz wasn't his real name, didn't know about the phones that rang in the middle of the night with assignments, didn't know about the times he disappeared for days or weeks at a time and came back with haunted eyes and blood under his fingernails that he could never completely wash away. The man who had been Miguel Santos stood in his kitchen one evening, preparing a simple meal, when his secure phone buzzed with a message. He read it, memorized the details, then deleted it. Another target, another corrupt official who'd taken money from the cartels, who'd sold out his own people for profit. Another name on a list that never seemed to get shorter no matter how many people he eliminated. He thought, as he often did, about Carlos, about whether his brother would understand what he'd become, whether Carlos would approve or be horrified. He thought about the score he'd settled, about the cartel he'd destroyed, about the price he'd paid and the price others had paid. He thought about justice and revenge, and whether there was really any difference between them when you got down to it. And then he finished his meal, packed his equipment, and left to complete his assignment. Because this was his life now. This was what he'd chosen when he decided that some debts had to be paid in blood, that some crimes couldn't go unpunished, that sometimes the only way to fight evil was to become something evil yourself. El Fantasma had become legend in Ciudad Frontera, a ghost story parents told their children about what happens when you push a good man too far. But the reality was something different, something darker. The reality was that Miguel Santos had died in that warehouse with his brother, and what emerged from his grief and rage was something that couldn't really be called human anymore. It was a weapon, a tool, a ghost that haunted the nightmares of men who thought they were untouchable. And somewhere in the darkness of Mexico's endless war against the cartels, that ghost continued its work, one target at a time, leaving behind bodies and questions and the faint scent of motor oil and revenge. They had taken his brother. He had taken their empire. But the cost of that victory was measured in the pieces of his soul he'd lost along the way, traded piece by piece for bullets and bombs, and the satisfaction of watching his enemies burn. In the end, Miguel Santos had proven that one man could make a difference, that justice could be found outside the law, that revenge could be achieved if you were willing to pay any price and sacrifice everything. But he'd also proven something darker, that the line between hero and monster is thinner than anyone wants to believe, and that once you cross that line, there's no going back. You can only keep moving forward, doing what needs to be done, and try not to think too much about what you've become in the process. The story of El Fantasma would be told and retold in Ciudad Frontera for generations, growing and changing with each telling, becoming myth and legend. But the truth was simpler and sadder than any legend. It was the story of a brother's love turned to rage, of grief transformed into violence, of a good man who became a killer because he lived in a world where sometimes that's the only option left. And late at night, in a house in Guadalajara, a man who used to be a mechanic would lie awake and remember. He'd remember his brother's smile, his father's lessons, the smell of motor oil and the sound of wrenches on metal. He'd remember the life he'd had before, the man he'd been. And he'd wonder if Carlos would have wanted this, if his brother's death justified everything that had come after. But those thoughts never lasted long, because there was always another assignment, another target, another mission. The phone would ring, and El Fantasma would answer. The ghost would return to the shadows where he belonged, doing the terrible work that someone had to do, carrying the weight of his choices like a cross he'd built from his brother's bones and his own shattered conscience. They took his brother. He took their empire. But what they'd really taken, Miguel sometimes thought in his darkest moments, was his humanity. And that was a price no amount of revenge could ever repay. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the darkness. This is the story of Miguel Santos, a man who showed us that the line between justice and vengeance is written in blood, and that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun or a bomb. It's a man with nothing left to lose. If this story affected you, if it made you think about the nature of justice and the cost of revenge, please consider subscribing to Real Conflict Zone. We bring you these stories not to glorify violence, but to explore the human condition at its most extreme, to understand what drives people to do the impossible, even when that impossible thing transforms them into something they never wanted to become. Until next time, stay safe, stay thoughtful, and remember, everyone has their breaking point. The question is, what happens when they reach it?